This is part 12 in a series of videos in which I am repairing and restoring a number of Intel MDS units. In the previous video in this series I got as far as refitting the monitor to the chassis that I've started to assemble, and we tested the monitor to make sure it was capable of displaying data, and that worked fine. The next thing I need to do is to reinstall the power supply. So this is the power supply I showed in a previous video. So I've been right through this supply, fully tested it, I've stripped it down, tested all the connections, tested all the components, made sure everything's done up tight, and I've made sure it's working the way it's supposed to. I did buy some additional electronic loads, and I previously showed this being tested with a single electronic load, but I have bought several more, and I will demonstrate this supply under a full load test in another video using those loads. But that's tested, that's all done, it works fine. I just want to do a final check on the supply voltages to make sure that all the rails are still fine. It's been run now for 24 hours on full load, and I'm just doing a final check before I refit it to the chassis. So I thought I'd do this one on video, and then we'll have a look at getting this back into the chassis and see if we can power up the entire chassis for the first time. So as ever, I've temporarily disconnected the cooling fan. I've got it hooked up to the VDB10, and the next thing is to power it up and test all the rails. So there are basically three interfaces that we need to test on this. We have this one, which goes to the InOut card on the back of the machine, and then we have two more that connect to the backplane on the chassis. So looking at the schematic for these, we have the connector here, which is this 9-way connector, and then we have this 7-way connector, which is this one. So we'll test these first, and I'll just go through. The only thing to bear in mind when testing these is some have the supply and return separated. On some of them they are interconnected on the power supply, on others they're not, so it's important to make sure that we identify the difference between supply, returns and grounds, because for some reason the grounds are interconnected in different places on the system. So I'll work through these. I'll just read out what's on the connector. Just bear in mind, as I said in a previous video, these are not in order, so I need to make sure I identify the correct pins on this. As usual, I have the part of the wiring loom fitted with the power switch on. Otherwise, of course, there'll be no power going to the transformer. I'll now power this up, and we're getting about 200 milliamps standby, which is correct. And looking at the schematic, we'll start to check the supply voltages. Okay, so I'll start by testing this interface, and what we should have is ground on this N pin, and then referring to the schematic, we've got the keyway, and then we should have minus 10 volts, which we do, and then minus 12, that's fine, plus 5, and plus 5 again, and then ground on the N1. It's important to note here that the 5-volt rail requires these return connections on this connector, which is why I've still got it plugged in. If we pull this out, then the 5-volt rail would be incorrect. It is a little bit high, so I might need to adjust that, but I'll wait until we've got it properly under load in the machine before I adjust that. If it doesn't need adjusting, I'll leave it alone. And so now I need to test this interface. So I'll reference ground here, and we should have 5 volts, which we do. 5-volt return. This one should be 12 volts, which it is. And that's all the power we have on that interface. The final interface is this one. This is a bit more complicated. It's got more rails going to it, and that is this interface up here. So again, I'll reference the schematic and we'll check the supplies we have on here. Bear in mind that a lot of these have the supply and the return and they don't have a common ground without the board plugged in. So that's just something we need to take into account when we're testing these rails. So we'll start with the first one. We should have 24 volts and a 24 volt return, which is fine. It's a little bit high, but it is completely unloaded, so that's not that surprising. The next one is plus 5 volts and ground, so we need to find a ground, and then plus 5 volts. Again, that's fine. Again, slightly high, but if you saw the testing I did with the electronic load, then you'll know that that comes down to slightly over 5 volts at the correct loading. We then have pin 4, which is the key, 2 more grounds, and then the next one should be 12 volts, which it is, and then we should have minus 10, minus 12, and then the final ones are the plus 15 and the plus 15 volt return. So I need to measure these both and not reference them to ground. So that's 15 volts, which is exactly what it should be. Okay, so all the rails are still fine. It's withstood its soak test, and the next thing is to get this supply put back into the chassis. We can then get it connected up and see if the chassis will start coming to life. Okay, so this is the chassis that I'm working on. I showed refitting the monitor assembly in the previous video, and now the power supply needs to be refitted, and the supply sits in this space here. Just to make sure I don't trap any cables, because the supply is quite heavy and difficult to handle, I'll just tape these cables up out of the way to make sure I don't do any damage to them. It'll just make the whole process far easier. So I'll get that one out of the way. Same thing with the ribbon cable. We'll just tape it up out of the way, and that way we can be certain we're not going to do any damage to anything. One thing I didn't show in the previous video was I connected these cables. So these are of course the power interface cables that go to the backplane, and they're the ones that plug onto the connectors that are on the top edge of the backplane. They're the ones that we connected to on the test jig. So next thing to do is to bring the power supply in, and then we'll start maneuvering it into position. And as we put it in, we need to make sure that we connect these to the correct connectors. They are keyed, so they're very difficult, although not impossible, to get in the wrong place. And as I've mentioned before, with a supply of this power, it is important not to make any mistakes with the power supply. So I'll just bring the supply in. Okay, so the first thing I need to do is to reconnect the fan. Okay, this connector goes through to the loom that goes to the switch on the front of the machine. Again, this is quite hard to get to once the supply is installed, so I'm going to feed the loom through now and get this connected before we go any further with the assembly. So that is this loom, and it just feeds through from the front of the chassis and comes out through this recess here. Okay, so I've routed the main switch wiring loom back through its proper channel. One important step that's often overlooked with these chassis is to level them, and what you have to do is the main part of the chassis and the bracket that all the internal parts sit on are both quite stiff assemblies, but they do twist slightly, and depending on how they were aligned when you put the screws in, they can be slightly twisted. So all you need to do is make sure that the bottom part of the chassis is sitting on a very flat level surface, which I've done here. I've made sure this is level, and then just slacken off the 5 screws. I'm going to take them out, just make them in fact, you heard it move then, it just clunked down a little bit. And the rear one, and the 2 on the left hand side. That's 1, 2, and then just retighten them. And that will guarantee that all the parts are going to line up. If you don't do that and you leave it twisted, you might find that certain parts won't fit in properly, and when you come to fit the outer case, it won't align, and you'll get a big gap down one side or the other. Okay, so that's that done. I'm just going to spin the chassis round so we can see the routing of the wiring loom. Okay, so the loom for the main switch comes up over the top of the fan. Again, don't leave it on the side because it can get drawn into the fan and short out. And then of course don't forget to reconnect the cooling fan itself. And then we end up with this connector, which is the one that allows power to be controlled going to the main power supply. So the next step is we'll bring the power supply in and get that installed and see if it will power up. Okay, I'll try and work around the camera without knocking it, but the power supply is quite heavy, so I might end up bumping into the camera here, but I'll try to avoid it. Now, of course, I've reconnected this fan as well. So there are two fans, there's this one and the one that connects here. And as we bring the supply in, we need to make sure we reconnect the two power cables that go through to the back plane. So they are different sizes, and as I said earlier, they are keyed. So this one, the shorter one, comes onto this socket, and this one goes onto the socket at the rear. So we'll start to slide this in, and we'll get to this point. We should be able to reconnect the two connectors onto the appropriate points on the supply. So that's the first one. And as the supply goes in, we can reconnect this part of the loom and also make sure that the supply slides in between the two mounting side cheeks on its mounting bracket. So I'll bring this connector up, I'll reconnect it to the loom, and it goes on one way of course. Okay, and get that put into the correct position. Make sure nothing's fouling. Connect the second of the two power connectors, making sure that the key goes the right way round, which it is. So it goes in there, and then we can push the power supply all the way in, making sure none of the wires get trapped, of course. So that particular one needs to go down a bit further. Okay, so I'm just checking to make sure it's lined up with the two holes on the side cheeks of the mounting bracket. So that's one. I need to do the same with the other side. That is the second one, and there are mounting holes in the bottom of the chassis as well. So there's one here and there's one here. So I'm just making sure they're lined up, and also making sure that the two holes on the end bracket of the supply front bracket are also lined up. So I'll get those 4 screws fitted, and then we can look at reconnecting the rear card. So I have the power supply bolted in. I've got the 2 screws at the back and the 2 screws that secure it to its mounting bracket refitted. The next item to go in is the InOut card. Normally there is a metal plate that sits on this, but I've taken that off for now so I can test this properly. Now I have powered this up separately. I'll show that in a separate video, but just so we don't make this video too long, we'll just pop this in and see what happens. So there are some guide rails that this sits on. It slides down, and then we have power that comes through to this connector, making sure we have the key the right way round, which is the 4th from this end, 3, 4. So that goes onto there. We then have the ribbon cable, which goes across onto here and onto this grounding screw. Just trying to avoid the camera here. And then finally we have the lead that comes from the monitor. And that goes on to that connector. Okay, so that's it all connected up. In theory we should now be able to power this up. It's not complete yet, there are other cards that need to go in, and of course the floppy drive. But I'm going through this in stages, as I've explained before, and so the next step is to see if this card boots up correctly and then see if it can properly interface with the central control card. Okay, I've double and triple checked everything. I've dimmed the lights in the lab, so hopefully if something does appear on the screen we'll be able to see it. I've checked all the connections. As you've seen, we've checked the supplies, we've checked the processor. So the processor card that's fitted to this chassis is the one that we were testing previously. So all things being equal, we should actually see something on the screen. It depends on the state of the InOut card and the processor, of course. We don't know if it will run yet. I have also plugged in a keyboard that I have done some testing on, and again I'll come back with some future videos to show the testing on those parts, but I just want to try and keep the focus on one chassis for now. So I'll try powering this up and we'll see if we end up with some magic smoke escaping or something on the screen. I would say that we'll probably get some fan noise. The fans are quite noisy on these, but hopefully we'll see something appear. It is a CRT, of course. It will take a few seconds to warm up, so we'll give it a few seconds. I can't see any smoke and the current drawn is correct, and we actually have something on the screen, so seriously. And it's the correct boot up, so we've gone straight into the monitor. That's what should happen. We don't have a floppy drive fitted, and we haven't gone into the diagnostics, so that should disappear in a few seconds from what I recall. But what I can do now is run the monitor program and we can start carrying out certain tests. I'll get the rear card properly attached. I'll put its cover plate back on, and we can then start running through some more in-depth testing of this particular chassis. But it's looking quite promising so far. The boot up has gone the way I would expect. That doesn't surprise me. That's what normally happens if you don't do anything with the monitor for too long. I'll reset and see if we can get the monitor back up. We can. So okay, it's looking good. That's it for this video. Any comments are welcome, but in the next video we'll start doing some actual in-system diagnostics.